Hello friends, in this video we are going to discuss about the laws of limiting factor. What are laws of limiting factor? In biology, a limiting factor is defined as an environmental factor or variable that has the potential to restrict the growth, abundance or distribution of a population in an ecosystem. These factors are present in limited supply. Thus, organisms compete for their limited availability in the ecosystem. The principle or law that helps to analyze the limiting factors in an ecosystem are Liebig laws of minimum, Blackman's limiting factor, Salford's law of tolerance. In the law of minimum, population growth can be controlled by a scarce resource but not with abundant resources. In the law of limiting factor, the rate of a biological or an ecological process that depends on several factors is limited by the slowest factor. In the law of tolerance, the survival success of an organism is suggested to be dependent on a complex set of environmental factors. Limiting factors can be density dependent or density independent. Limiting factors are single limiting when only one factor limits the system, co-limiting factors when a factor exerts an indirect restrictive effect or enhances the effect of a direct limiting factor. Examples of factors that limit population size are food, nutrients, shelter, and mates. These resources are limited in the ecosystem, and as a result, they can induce living things to compete for them. Principle and law of limiting factors. The principle and the law of limiting factors is defined as the principle by which a factor that is in short supply will limit the growth and development of an organism or community. Blackman's law of limiting factors, Liebig's law of minimum and Salford laws of tolerance are laws that explain the principle of limiting factors. Liebig's law of minimum. Liebig's law of minimums was strictly developed by Carl Sprengel and later popularized by Justus von Liebig. This law states that growth is governed by a limiting factor, that is scarce resources, rather than the total resources available. In biology and ecology, this means that population growth is restricted by factors that are scarce, not by factors that are abundant. It was based on observation of crop growth. Accordingly, adding abundant nutrients did not increase growth. Conversely, the addition of scarce nutrients, which is the limiting factor in this case, has increased crop growth. This means that even if some nutrients are abundant in the soil, but other nutrients are limited and relatively few, the crop will not grow. Applying this principle to the other biological populations, if shows growth to be determined only by the most limiting factor. This principle was used by William Cumming Ross as the basis for identifying amino acids that are labeled as essential. Blackman's law of limiting factors. The law of limiting factors was proposed by the British plant physiologist Frederick Frost Blackman in 1905. According to this law, a process that depends on a number of factors will have its rate limited by the speed of the slowest factor. For example, photosynthesis is a biological process that depends on many factors. The general chemical reaction of photosynthesis is 6CO2 plus 12H2O plus energy is equals to C6H12O6 plus 6O2 plus 6H2O. Based on this equation, CO2 and H2O, the light energy, sunlight, are limiting factors of this reaction. If any of them become accessible at a slower or lesser rate than usual, the rate of photosynthesis is expected to be slow depending on the speed of the slowest factor. For example, if CO2 concentrations become scarce, for example due to the closure of stomata opening in response to elevated temperatures in the atmosphere, the rate of photosynthesis slows down even though H2O and light energy levels be sufficiently available. The same result would be if light energy was less available or less intense, slowing down the rate of photosynthesis despite the abundance of CO2 and H2O. Light becomes a limiting factor in photosynthesis when plants are unable to collect light. For example, due to shadows resulting from dense population of plants. Sulford Law of Tolerance. The law of tolerance was developed in 1913 by the American geologist Victor Ernest Sulford. It states that the success of an organism depends on a complex set of environmental conditions, and that organisms will have definite minimum, maximum, and optimum environmental factors that determine success. These indicate the extent of tolerance of that organisms. However, the extent of tolerance within the same organisms may vary, for example, depending on the stage of life, larval versus adult. Types of limiting factors. Density dependent limiting factor. Density dependent limiting factor refers to the limiting factor of the size of a population based on density. A large dense population is more affected than a smaller or less dense population. For example, a dense population will have a higher demand for food and water than the smaller population. In this case, the supply of food and water is the limiting factor and depends on the density. Disease as a factor is also more dependent on density than in small ones. It spreads rapidly in a dense population. Density independent limiting factor. Density independent limiting factor refers to the limiting factor that is not dependent on density. The limiting factor can limit the size of the population independently of how dense the population is. For example, a catastrophic event such as an earthquake or volcanic eruption can cause a population decline regardless of limited and co-population density. Single limiting and co-limiting. A single limiting factor system is a co-limiting factor when a factor affects the population of organisms in an ecosystem indirectly, but increases the extent of a factor that directly affects the population with one factor that limits the system. Examples of limiting factors. In the law of population size, a population will grow rapidly as long as the environment to which all individuals in that population are exposed remain constant. Thus, if environmental conditions are kept the same, the population is expected to increase. However, there will come a time when the population will reach the maximum at which the environment can be sustained. This is called the carrying capacity environment, the maximum load of the environment. Carrying capacity is the number of individuals that an environment can sustain without causing harm or destruction to organisms and the environment. Thus, the size of the population may increase till the carrying capacity is met. Above this capacity, the population size will eventually decrease. The determinants of carrying capacity are the limiting factors. Common limiting factors: ecosystem is food, water, habitat, The availability of these factors will affect the carrying capacity of the environment. As the population increases, the demand for food also increases. Since food is a limited resource, organisms will start competing for it. The same thing goes for space, nutrients, and mate. Since these resources are available in limited quantities for a given period of time, inhabitants' ecosystems will compete, possibly against the same species, intraspecific competition, or against another group of species, interspecific competition. While a biotic factor includes the activities of a living component of an ecosystem, an abiotic factor includes the various factors of an ecosystem. These physio-chemical factors include sunlight, humidity, temperature, atmosphere, soil, land geology, and water resources. For example, temperature is a major limiting factor primarily due to the fact that it affects the effectiveness of enzymes and catalysts, which are both biological and chemical essential in an efficient system.